Hello humans, I'm Alora Scott, the Storytelling Saiyan. Happy New Year and welcome to Story Kitchen. So, villains. I seen this tweet a while back during the WGA and SAG strike, and they mentioned that they would be embarrassed to write a villain as cartoonishly evil as this. And I gotta ask, why? Villains seem to have gone through this revival I've noticed since the 2010s, where they have some redeeming qualities or an emotional complex backstory that helps the audience understand and maybe even empathize where they're coming from. And there are some terrific complex villains out there. But I want to know why storytellers now are almost averse to writing just blatantly monstrous villains. Like, villains are supposed to be dangerous, hateful, destructive. The characters that they hurt or killed won't appreciate their backstory. I've also noticed that a lot of times with these complex villains, they have a deep personal motivation or they have a close antagonistic relationship with the protagonist. But what about villains that are just really bad, really dangerous, and the impact of their evil and terror is deeply felt by all the characters catastrophically? The most evil villains I can think of are the ones who take over the world. Today, I want to explore what makes a villain the fucking worst. I think there are some key factors about villains that highlight their evil in storytelling. And there'll be some overlap in these concepts, but I think they all paint what a truly vicious villain can be capable of. So this is why you should make your villains evil as fuck, because it's right in front of your face. Let's cook. The isolated bubble of wealth and ownership. Evil world villains are rich, and they gain their luxury, comfort, and the benefits of an easy life off the backs of the people who make their money for them. Villains are isolated amongst each other, far removed from the destruction they cause or the consequences of their theft. When I say that a villain makes their money off of a lot of other people's work, I mean that they own the jobs that offer goods and services, and the characters work those jobs to make them rich in the story. When a wealthy villain has ownership over someone else's work, they can treat those characters as badly as they want. And if an evil villain wants to take all the money of the job, which they absolutely do, they will starve their victims while also keeping them dependent on working for their money back. It could be an intergalactic space pirate. If they are at the head of the ship, they get the cream of the wealth. And if a character is poor and struggling under a villainous owner, then they have so much work to do. Too much work. So you have a villain who's working their characters to death. They usually keep them working in conditions that destroy the character's health and well-being and spirit. Villains will usually have people working in bad industries that also negatively affect the world the story is being told in. If there is a way to sell goods, villains will find a way to make themselves rich off it. Evil rich villains makes everybody pay for them to be rich. Even if the product or service is shitty or poorly made, even if the villain finds other ways to hurt people with their money-making enterprise, a villain makes their coin off the customer too. Who works to not buy things? If you're telling a story with evil rich villains, their victims are the ones who work to pay for everything the villain owns. And oftentimes, the villain owns everything. It's a circle. And rich villains bank on it. They can set their prices impossibly high, forcing more money out of customers, forcing their victims to work longer and harder to afford it. If villains own characters' basic necessities like home, food, and purpose, they make characters' lives impossible to maintain without suffering. Wealthy villains put the squeeze on their victims, leading to misery and suffering through breaking down bodies, impossible living conditions, sickness, fear for safety, and wasted spirit. And of course, these villains, with their wealth, will be shielded from the destruction they cause. I said villains are isolated. They usually spend their money on luxury, big homes with plenty of resources, access to insane technology, if you're telling a modern or futuristic story, and security. Evil villains can buy their way away from the misery that they cause. But wealth alone is not the only way that villains spread their evil. It has to be legitimized. Rich villains only deal with each other. Governmental power. When you think of government in storytelling, you should be thinking of the character of government itself. It doesn't matter if it is a king and a queen or if it's a democracy. Government is the management of the general population in a story, and it is how world building organizes itself. That usually includes the creation of laws, protection of the community, management of food, staples, goods and services, property, and land development. The normal people pay dues or taxes for this management. Rich villains are legitimized when a government only endorses the villainous schemes that enrich them both, at the detriment of the other characters in the story world. So with a villainous government with evil priorities, it's important to examine what they will allow to create wealth in a world and what they will restrict to create victims. Say there are institutions and services that would increase the wealth and knowledge of the general characters in a story. Well, if it's at odds with the way the rich villains gain their wealth, which is stolen from the work of others, an evil government is going to make it legal for the villains to carry on and illegal for the characters to defy them. The only way rich villains can maintain their legitimacy with a government is by giving it money. So it could be through donations, gifts, deals, anything that is considered value in your world building. In exchange, the government makes policies and laws that support or allow the abuses of rich villains. One big way world-dominating governments could legitimize rich villains is by giving the tax dollars to support the villain's enterprise. Even if the villain is exploiting the regular characters that work for them, an evil government will aid in that wealth extraction. Think of an evil government that obstructs an advancement that is needed by everyone in the story's society. Instead, they allow the rich villain to sell it for as much as they want. Think of a chaotic evil villain who will allow unnecessary, disruptive bursts of death that destroy regular citizens on a regular basis because they make money from it. If villains are making a lot of money through, say, a technology or a natural substance that causes destruction of a story's world or its victims, a villainous government will most likely pay to keep that industry going, despite the cost and harm to the public in the story. Villains make it so regular characters can never influence a government with wealth like they do. A villainous government will lock out any undesirables who would be a threat to how they manage a group of characters. What if there is a crisis, an absolute danger to the well-being of a story's characters or to the story world? Well, if a villainous government is paid by rich villains that are in that crisis industry, it won't be managed. An evil government in a story would allow rich villains to acquire and sell whatever it wants, no matter the cost of life or destruction to its world. They keep each other paid through villainy. Information control. If a villain can convince characters what they say is true and right and beneficial, they can carry out their evil plans without much resistance. It's usually sourced through well-funded, expansive means of communication. Evil villains control the flow of information to characters. And it's officially paid for by villains to convince the regular characters that they are not villains. Villains use major centers for information to keep normal characters' behavior under their control, often with lies. And if it isn't with lies, then villains will use their information to omit the truth. Evil villains obscure reality from the people who depend on them for information. Characters who don't know the true side of the villain's deeds won't know how to respond or escape from the pain and danger it will cause. And when misdirection doesn't work, villains will use their money and official channels to delegitimize, discredit, slander, and suppress opposing views, or even the heroes that expose the villains for who they are. The impact of information is important when exploring villains and evil. Charismatic leaders. Celebrities, influencers, and charlatans. Some evil villains are charismatic leaders who personally convinces regular characters to accept the operation of their evil plans and to pay for it. Of course, just like the majority of these types of villains, evil charismatic leaders are completely away and above the people they are designed to influence. A lot of them are smart, attractive, well-spoken, and passionate. They know how to make people feel like they're understood and being listened to, and regular characters believe the influencer villain has their best interest in mind. And the reason for that is because the charismatic leader knows they are the cause of the pain that their fans are suffering from. The charismatic villain does not give a fuck about the people they're influencing. They are there to get the evil plans in motion with a nice face to it. evil influencers tell their audience they have the solution to their problem. Think of an evil representative who openly sympathizes with a tragic death, but they endorse the same reality that brings on more tragedy and senseless suffering. And inversely, the charismatic leader is living life nice. They can travel freely, wear the most expensive clothes, buy enormous houses, and send their kids to private school. These villains are the mascots, the pretty advertiser of villainy. Nothing they have to offer really helps the ones they target. So how is it that charismatic leaders have so many supporters and fans? Pawns, useful idiots. Villains make villains. Pawns are the faithful, the characters who put their money, time, and organization into these pillars of villainy. They believe that if they keep supporting the villains to make their life right, they'll finally be able to get some of the benefits they paid for. Or pawns are just fearful characters who put their stock into one villain because their villain taught them to fear what other villains might do. Pawns accept their part in villainy because they think they can get something out of it, but they never do. Not fully. Some pawns make it, but most don't. They're never truly safe, happy, satisfied, or able to be independent and secure. Pawns know that they're being hurt. They know it's wrong. They know that they're selling their lives for less, but they do it anyway and shame and ostracize characters who don't. And if the shame doesn't work, the broken bones will. Fight makes right. You can't be a villain if you don't bring heat. One of the biggest identifiers of a villain is their violence. Violence makes characters' life hell. Evil villains will make the story move along with their plans at the point of a sword, the end of a bullet, or a laser gun. The worst villains never get their hands dirty, and they cash in on their violence. Villains control their opponents and victims through being threatening and dangerous. They create an air of fear in the characters they terrorize. And if villains aren't using their muscle to kill characters, they make them enemies of each other. These kinds of villain are an enemy to everyone in some sense, even to themselves. Villains use violence as a way to gain wealth. In a story, it works as a heinous form of population control. Keep characters afraid, keep characters obedient, keep characters working. And they damn sure not gonna let that happen to them. Villains put a million bodies before themselves. Now the violent hands, the henchmen that do the villain's rough, dirty work, could either be forced into that life or they might legitimately enjoy and benefit from what they do. But unlike evil villains, the violent henchman is always at risk of danger or madness, the decay of their bodies and soul in service for villains. The most evil villains don't stop their violence. If they have the means, they will expand death and suffering everywhere they can make money in the story. If a truly ugly, nasty, evil villain were to take over some world, they would be using other people to fight, kill, and die for them in it. Contempt for the living. A villain does not give a fuck about the characters that they are hurting. I think we established that. Ally or opponent, villains often enjoy the pain they can place on the people under their thumb. World-dominating villains must grow their power while historically, violently taking it away from their victims. But the villains hate themselves the most, detached from the reality of the story's world. They have a hostile, hateful approach to engaging in the story, and they have no concern for the pain or death they cause, even to themselves. They hate everything that makes them who they are. They hate the world that they're in. They want to destroy it. So everybody gets it. Everybody has to partake in the pain the villains don't feel and never be free of it. If a villain can raise hell in money, they will make it hell for as many people as they can. The most evil villain has a broken spirit, and so it has to break the spirit of every other character to make it normal. Who will save characters when a villain is so evil they intend on taking over the world? Heroes are supposed to be the answer to villains. They're supposed to be the justice and protection of the victim characters. I can think of one heroic character who was called to be a hero when the world is ending. But that video is for another day. Thank you for watching. I want to hear how y'all feel about villains and writing villains in the comments. And whatever else y'all want to talk about in the comments, just leave it down below. More than 100 of you have joined me on this journey, and I thank you for being with me because I want to talk with y'all all about why storytelling is one of the greatest gifts in the world. So if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Follow me on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, and I will see y'all next time. Thank you. Goodbye.